Welcome to the Sports Science Dudes. I am your host, Dr. Jose Antonio, with my inimitable co-host, Dr. Tony Ricci. If you are not a subscriber to the show, hit the subscribe button. Also hit like. You don't have to hit dislike because we're very likable guys. At least Tony is. I don't know about myself. So make sure you subscribe. Now, before I introduce our guests, I do want to promote the ISSN conference. It is June 15 to 17, Fort Lauderdale Beach. You can register at issn.net. That is issn.net. Now, introductions. We got really two special guests. There's a lot of IQ power going on in this episode here, so this will be a fun show. Darren Candow, he is a professor and director of the Aging, Muscle, and Bone Health Laboratory in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Health Studies at the University of Regina in the great province of Saskatchewan, Canada. I hope it's a great province because I just said it was great. The overall objectives of Dr. Candow's internationally renowned research program are to develop effective lifestyle interventions involving nutrition, primarily creatine monohydrate, and physical activity, which have practical and clinical relevance for improving musculoskeletal aging and reducing the risks of falls and fractures. Dr. Candow has published well over 100 peer-reviewed papers, supervised over 20 master's students and PhD students, and has received research funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Canadian Foundation for Innovation, the Saskatchewan Health Research Foundation, and the Nutritia Research Foundation. He's also on the editorial review boards for JISSN, Nutrients, and Frontiers. You can find him on Twitter and on Instagram. Just type in his name, it'll show up. And then we have Dr. Scott Forbes, an associate prof, Department of Physical Education Studies in Brandon University in Manitoba. Hey, Tony, do you know which province Manitoba is? If you go left to right, you got British Columbia, then most Americans are like, we don't know what's in the middle.
I think Manitoba is in between Saskatchewan and BC, no?
I don't think so. No. Typical American. No, I think Manitoba it's Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, I think.
Oh, okay. So it's east. It's east.
Yeah,
all right.
Yeah. So I've never been in Manitoba, maybe one of these days. Also, Dr. Forbes is an adjunct prof in Faculty of Kinesiology and Health Studies at University of Regina in Canada. He's also a certified sports nutritionist through the ISSN and a clinical exercise physiologist and high performance specialist through the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology. Dr. Forbes is better well known as Dr. Creatine on social media. So
here he is.
What's interesting, I had a student text me the other day and he's like, hey, could you ask Dr. Creatine on your show about X, Y, and Z? I'm like, oh, you mean Scott? Like, oh, yeah, Scott. Dr. Creatine. Scott's research examines various nutritional, example, creatine and protein, and exercise interventions to enhance muscle, bone, and brain function in many, many populations. That is quite a mouthful for introducing you to Brainiac. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us. Awesome.
Yeah, happy to be here.
I think, Tony's first time we've had Canadians, like double Canadians on the show.
Yeah, you guys still got snow, or what's happening that way?
There's a big snowstorm coming Wednesday, 20 more centimeters.
Oh my.
I'm out in BC, so it's a bit different, but the Bears are awake and we're it's Canadian, it's Canada. It's all different.
All right.
Hey,
Yeah, we still have our shovels out, so we're
crazy.
ready for the snowstorm.
All right. Well, we got, as you know, I think we broke a world record, actually, 26 inches of rain in 8 hours here in Fort Lauderdale. So.
Wow.
well, luckily it's sunny now, so it's looking quite nice.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll sit on the patio after this. Now, okay, I want to start this way because, again, the four of us go to the same barber, and I get this question all the time, as does Tony. Does creatine cause baldness? I mean, we know the answer, but Scott, pipe in. Does it cause baldness?
Absolutely not. There's no evidence for that. So as kind of we were discussing at the start, there's a study in rugby players that showed an increased conversion of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone, or DHT, with creatine, and DHT has been linked to male pattern baldness, but there's lots of kind of nuances with that particular study. And yeah, there's absolutely no evidence that creatine actually causes hair loss.
Yeah, Darren, comment on this, but I haven't read that study in a while, but I had thought that the actual DHT levels were actually, even though they were elevated, it was all within the normal range. Like it was low normal, then it was still normal. So there was it was never outside of the physiologic range from what I recall, Darren.
Yeah, they were all within the normal range. But a couple things for the viewers is resistance training will increase the conversion DHT regardless. Now, they did a good design, they did a crossover design, but one thing that never gets any press is they combined high dose creatine with high dose glucose. And they did that, and then it has 6-week washout. But if you look at the data, usually when an individual will take that much creatine and glucose for 7 days, there's usually an increase in body mass, and it was flatline. They measured them at 7 days in, and then again 21 days later, there was no change. So you start to speculate what was happening. They just measured a hormone, and we've talked about this. The acute shock for hormones regarding muscle protein synthesis never correlate with a dry muscle mass, right? You can have an increase in mTOR, but it may not lead to an increase in muscle. And since no hair follicle was measured cross-sectional area, just because DHT went up, it had no effect. And I put it this way, I've probably assessed over 1,000 people in the lab, and not a single person came to me and said, you know what, I don't know what I'm on, but my hair is falling out. And you got to believe that would be one of the first things that an individual, male or female, would come to you and say, hey, listen, my hair is thinning, and we've done 2-year studies with creatine every day, and not a single person. So, there's never been a study to say it emphatically doesn't, but there's certainly no evidence to suggest it does. And increasing a snapshot of a hormone, just like IGF-1 or testosterone, doesn't really lead to anything until it's measured. All we can say is this hormone went up from a physiological perspective within range, and probably a lot of other things did with resistance training. So there was a lot of caveats with that study, and they use skin folds for a lot of things. And yeah, so it is what it is. But people, I probably get that question literally on a daily basis.
Wow.
Yeah.
And just a quick question, gentlemen. The increase in DHT is not a lot. Isn't it follicular sensitivity and the receptors that are picking it up anyway? In better words, just the rise in DHT itself. I know the conversion occurs with everyone, and some people have a greater conversion than others. But I think it's the follicle itself and its sensitivity and it picking it up that really destroys the follicle, not just an increased presence of DHT.
That's correct. It's the androgen receptor, and then how it leads to the increase at the nucleus. So it's like I said, there's lots of individuals looking at acute hormonal regulation with muscle protein synthesis, and they're like, oh, we did a snapshot. Well, sometimes these snapshot hormones that rise don't correlate to dry muscle mass or increase over time. So and it depends when the biopsy is done and all that, and it's no different than a hormone. And I argue, we talk about creatinine, people, I'm on creatine, they go to the doctor, and I say, well, it makes sense, creatinine is going to be elevated because it has to be, and then the kidney diffuse acutely. But if it's elevated for a long period of time, there's issues. And it just so happens when you went to the doctor, and when they do a reliability study, pre and post or multiple, it doesn't affect it. So the hormonal fluctuations are always a nuance, and is really an area of interest. But I could come out and say, I just show creatine caused cancer or cured cancer, but yet they only care about, does it cause baldness? It's quite funny, yeah. And that's actually spurred the myths and misconception paper. I literally said, I've had enough of this question. Let's put it to rest, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the ironic part of the misconception paper is that misconception still has legs.
Yes.
What's funny? It almost doesn't matter what's published. I'm like, these are the same questions I keep getting. What's going on? And in fact, I'm glad you mentioned the kidney issue, because that's probably the second most common question I get. To either one of you, let's go to Scott. What are the markers that you would suggest? Like when someone goes to a physician, like, hey, Scott, I don't know how to interpret this data. We got GFR, we got creatinine. What should they be looking for? And let's take two populations, your normal exercising population, and then maybe someone who's at risk, who maybe has a family history of CKD or something like that. Mm-hmm. Are there things they should all look at?
Yeah, for sure. So I think just to kind of take a step backwards, we know that creatine is non-enzymatically broken down into creatinine. And creatinine is often measured in the blood as an indicator of kidney damage. And so if you have creatine supplementation, you're going to have higher creatinine levels. and then that's interpreted as actual kidney damage with, and that's an inappropriate interpretation. So that needs to be kind of mentioned first, that if you just use creatinine, that's not a good thing to actually use to actually indicate kidney damage. And we know that that's also associated with an increase in dietary protein. It's also increased with an increase in muscle mass. And there's other factors that can influence creatinine levels. So if somebody's jacked with a lot of muscle that does a lot of resistance training and eats a lot of protein and also consumes creatine, probably using creatinine as an indicator of kidney health is just absolutely inappropriate. So that needs to be mentioned. So there are other markers that you can use. Cystatin C is another marker that is not influenced by muscle mass or dietary intake of protein and seems to be sensitive to kidney damage as well. So that's perhaps a better marker. And there's some great groups, one in particular from Brazil, that's done quite a bit of research on creatine supplementation and kidney damage. That's Hamilton Rochelle and Bruno Ulano. And they've shown that, you know, taking creatine for 10 grams a day for 3 months, for example, combined with aerobic exercise actually improved their kidneys based off this marker of cystatin C.
I want to go back to that 10 grams a day because it brings me back to a question that someone asked me about. A colleague of mine, we published some, and it was almost like we accidentally published this. We weren't really looking for it, but looking at some cognitive changes or markers in untrained people. And that there were, it seemed like in untrained people, they seemed to be some improvement in some of these cognitive markers. And the question came up from people who were not exercise scientists. They said, well, how do you know if the 3 to 5 grams is an adequate dose? Couldn't it be a different dose for the brain? And the God's honest truth is, I was like, actually, I don't know. I have no idea. So I'm going to throw this to you, Darren. And how would you answer that question? Do we need a different dose for, you know, changing levels in the brain?
Yeah, me and Scott are actually working on a paper. So this is another thing that I think I was one of the few proponents of this. I said, you know, we got a little complacent with our recommendations, right? So the Roger Harrison Holtman paper, they looked at average individuals, and the average weight was about 78 kilograms. And I'm with Rick Kreider. I still don't buy the ceiling effect on some of these individuals, because we actually have humans now 220 pounds, 250. Are you trying to tell me their maximal amount is about 180 grams in their muscle compared to a smaller individual? That's all fine and dandy, and we just took that for what it is. But what we're starting to see is, and Adam Persky's probably written one of the best creatine series of reviews, 2003, and he made a good analogy that the only way we're getting creatine interskeletal muscles with the transporters, and just like GLUT4, the larger you are, in theory, you should have more doorways. So that's why we've developed this relative dosage in our lab, 0.1 gram per kg. It just seems to be just very similar to caffeine, but 3 to 5 grams, it's totally based off Roger Harris and Eric Holtman's papers, in a sense that we excrete about 1 to 3 grams a day as creatinine, and we synthesize about 1 to 3 independent of your diet. So Roger's paper, when you took an oral dose of 5 grams, it caused a huge increase in blood creatine levels, and the theory was over time that would get into the muscle. And lo and behold, 3 to 5 grams seems to be very effective from a skeletal muscle perspective. But to your point, there's never been a single study on the planet shown that anything less than 8 grams of creatine a day with exercise is better for bone. So immediately you're thinking, okay, 2 different tissues. And then when you look at the meta-analyses that have looked at all the brain creatine content, and Serge Ostiak has shown some data with acute dosages with brain creatine content about 5 grams. But when you look at all the data, it seems to be on average about 10 grams a day seems to be there for a longer period of time. So I personally take 10 grams a day for a whole body perspective. But if someone says, I'm worried about increasing bench press performance, I think 3 to 5 grams a day, every day for months is fine. We're not seeing any of that with bone. However, there's never been a dosing, a study where we look at 5 grams versus 10 grams with bone, and that's planned for my lab as well. And then I look at everything going on in the world.
Darren, let me interrupt you real
Yep.
quick. In bone, what would be the time course you would look at? If, let's say you're getting subjects who 10 grams a day, are we talking 6 months, 12 months, a
Yeah.
year? I mean, because bone, it just takes a long time to
Yeah,
adapt.
so Phil Chillebeck, our previous mentor, he showed in 12 weeks at a pretty high dose, including a loading phase, increased bone mineral content. And that's kind of irrelevant from a health perspective, but look at bone mineral density. We're looking at a year or two, and that's why these studies are so difficult to do. We can look at NTL peptides, and it seems to be still the higher dose seems to be effective. And me and Phil have an amazing a study coming out in MSSE soon, 2 years, every day, 10 grams a day, for 2 straight years in postmenopausal females to look at bone strength and bone biology, and some interesting data there. But getting back to the brain, bone, and then we haven't talked about the immune system, during times of metabolic stress, if 95% of your ingested dose goes to your muscle, and there's only 5% to go to your testes or brain or bone, it kind of makes sense. You may need a longer, higher dose for an extended period of time to get into those areas. And as we know, the astrocytes don't like to produce creatine. The transporters are turned off. So I personally think when you're sleep deprived or having metabolic stress or neurological diseases, 10 grams might be a pretty good total body dose. And no one has shown me any negative side effects from that dosage. So I personally take 10 grams a day. I take 5 in the morning, and then I actually drink 5 during my workout. It's an easy way to get it in. And I might even increase it more during times of stressors. And I think we've sort of looked at, it's very similar to protein, 0.8 grams. No one in their right mind would take 0.8 grams per kilogram and think it's not going to have benefits. And you've shown, you can go well over 2 and have some really good benefits. And the naysayers will say, whoa, that's way too much. It must kill your kidneys. And of course, we have the data now. So I think that's the evolution. I think it could be tissue specific. But if you're just looking to get bigger biceps, maybe a smaller dose. But I think the neck up might be more important, obviously. And then when we get into clinical populations, frailty, cachexia, cancer, higher dose. So,
Scott, what do you think?
Fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd just like to point out that it's still in its infancy. We haven't done those dose response studies yet. So yeah, Darren has some work to do to look at the dose response of creatine supplementation on bone. But yeah, when you look at the individual studies, and we wrote a short kind of editorial commentary on that last year that we got published. It was the studies that used the higher dose of creatine that showed the positive benefits on bone tissue.
mm-hmm.
And then for the brain, it just seems like a higher dose of creatine is required. So that's speculation. And I think we need to do those dose response studies to really look at that.
So Tony, how much do you take a day of creatine?
Well, it would bring me to a question for the gentleman too, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So maybe Dr. Scott, Dr. Darren, you can address this. So I'm a low doser, and this is not good news for me, because the problem is, and by the way, a tremendous advocate of it. But if when I do 10 grams a day, I'm looking at 10 to 11 pounds of weight gain. So that's just my body type, and I don't know why. So maybe if it's okay here to potentially discuss what might be the individual variables too that would lead to one person responding with that much of a weight gain versus maybe Darren, you said about 10 grams a day and maybe had a much more muted weight response. So I tend to stay lower to try to, my hope was to get some new, the neuroprotective benefit, but obviously I'm not at my dosing. So
yeah, so like I personally don't eat red meat, but I eat a lot of seafood, and there's minimal amounts in dairy and poultry. However, there's ways we've done this. So one of the most difficult things with creatine is that acute water retention or weight gain. And what we're starting to see, if you can take multiple really small doses throughout the day, if it's feasible, that definitely decreases the net water retention, which actually is a good thing, but from a weight perspective. So we've even reduced it to 1 to 2 grams a day per serving. So you can take it 3 or 4 times with a meal, put a quarter teaspoon in breakfast, lunch, dinner. And that seems to be a little bit more viable there. So I might respond a little bit better. But if you're eating a lot of red meat and seafood during the week and then taking this, you're probably going to get to the point of a non-responder from a perspective. But again, The non-responder is only from a muscle perspective. We have no clue what a non-responder from a bone or brain or other areas of the body. I think the big area that's evolving is the immune system response. We're starting to see in animals this anti-inflammatory effects of creatine, and it could be just as an important from a recovery perspective. So I'm thinking of diseases like cachexia or cancer or HIV that are heightened inflammation. And we're doing a study in individuals post-prostate cancer with Kieran Farriman in South Carolina. We're looking at the effects there of creatine on whole body. So as you guys know, it's gone from the athlete to a clinical population, and that's the symposium we're presenting. That's why I'm not going to ISSN. We're doing it at ACSM this year, and then I'm talking about brain health in Paris a couple of weeks later. So it's kind of evolved, and it's been around for a century, and yet we still got so many unanswered questions. But I would recommend, if you're a weight gainer with it, you may want to just do lower dosages. But keep in mind, even that super low dose will eventually accumulate over time. But maybe when you're metabolically stressed, whatever's going on in your life and it's super stressful, it's a good time to crank it up. Like people have asked, will creatine prevent COVID? I said, no. Like I said, the only thing creatine can enhance is potentially your ability to have an immune system that's healthier to respond. But I got COVID twice, and I probably take just as much as anybody on the planet. So it's not a miracle cure. It's just something that can help overall health. Yeah. So,
and then maybe I can have, that was fantastic. And that's an approach I'm going to try, actually, because I can see that I have it. And then, so Scott, what would be some of the variables though that may lead to more weight gain in me? Is it fiber time specific? What might be some of those factors? Because I will tell you this, at 10 grams, I can bend a Volkswagen in half. I'm not, man, I get strong and it's fascinating.
Yeah.
But I'm an older guy and I just don't want to, whether it's water or not, I prefer not to carry that much, the extra weight.
Yeah.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I have more slow twitch or type 1 muscle fibers, so I don't respond as well to creatine supplementation. So kind of to your point, there's a great study done by my former PhD supervisor, Dr. Gordon Bell, and his colleague, Dr. Dan Siratak, and they actually showed responders versus non-responders to creatine supplementation, and responders tended to have lower amounts of creatine within their diet, and that's what Dr. Candow is talking about. But responders also had, they also had more or higher distribution of type 2 muscle fibers. So they had, I can't remember the exact numbers, but they had about 63 to 65% fast twitch fibers, whereas the non-responders had about 35% fast twitch fibers. And we know that individuals can have, an even higher distribution of fast twitch fibers than that. So maybe, I don't know, you're probably sitting around like 85, 90% fast twitch fibers. It's really explosive.
I'm in desperate need of a type 1 fiber. I'm searching desperately for one.
Yeah, Tony walks into a weight room and he takes a deep breath and he hypertrophies. So
it's not good. Yeah. But no, that's fascinating. So good for our listeners to know.
I just want to piggyback off that because we were talking about the tissue. So one of probably the best studies in the last decade was Bruno Gualiano's group, where they looked at brain creatine content in vegans, older individuals, young, and diet. And it was kind of cool because we definitely know muscle is responder, non-responder, the habitual diet, but the brain was not. It didn't matter if you were a vegan, omnivore diet, young or older, the brain creatine was independent. So that's to Jose's point. We think the tissues could be a bit selective, and it is interesting, but I think anybody in the right mind says, I'm only taking creatine now with all this evidence just for my bicep. I'm like, okay, great. But I say, wouldn't you want to take it maybe for your bone health as you get older? You might have a history of osteoporosis, or for your brain. I mean, sleep deprivation, metabolic stress, concussion. And they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So I'm thinking, I just don't see why you wouldn't take slightly more, and you can take it, a little bit more frequent. And Scott's on a committee in my PhD. So, well, Flavia, the theory here is that if you take more frequent, smaller dosages, Roger Harris showed you had less urinary creatine and creatinine. So if you take smaller dosages, hence these little gummies, you might be able to retain more instead of a big bolus, and therefore you might have less or more coming into the muscle and less being excreted. So that's a theory. So there's a lot of things we still need to answer, surprisingly. But it's every paper that comes out is very similar to how protein has evolved. Massive. We always thought we couldn't digest all the protein and absorb it. Now we know we do, but it was all this theory of like low dose protein. And then we're like, my God, I can't imagine anybody taking less than 1.2 nowadays. And so I wonder if creatine's following suit with that within reason. But new technology and more clinical trials need to be done. And but I see it, yeah, as an evolving perspective. But I look at it as a total body supplement. I argue I don't know anybody on the planet that can't benefit from creatine in some way, shape, or form. Yeah.
You know, in reference, you had alluded to your diet not having red meat, but you eat a lot of fish.
Yes.
And the nation of Japan consumes 20% of the world's fish.
Okay.
And I was wondering if anyone has looked at that population versus non-fish eating populations, you know, just doing I would say a simple cross-sectional study, but none of these studies are actually very simple.
Yeah.
To see if there's any differences in any of these parameters, because the Japanese probably on average consume more creatine than other populations. Yeah. And I haven't seen it, and I'm wondering if people are thinking about stuff like that. Scott, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any studies that have specifically looked at Japanese, but I know Sergei Ostojic has done quite a few studies looking at dietary creatine intake. So he's trying to look at how much creatine you get in your diet. And they've shown associations with everything from memory to childhood growth to just, yeah, other markers of health as well. So, and then there's been some studies looking at dietary creatine intake and depression as well. So the more creatine you got in your diet, the less risk of depression you had as well. So again, those studies weren't done in Japanese specifically, but yeah, I think that'd be a really interesting study to do.
Yeah, and those are retrospective things, but Roger was the first to actually look at meat compared to the supplement, and they actually got in the bloodstream the same. But it's funny, no one has ever done a diet versus supplement form to see if you get the same bioavailability or uptake from a performance perspective. Roger's been the first to show, yeah, the steak actually was better than the lozenge and the extract. So it is interesting that dietary creatine definitely influences it, but the bioavailability is still going to be almost 100% for whatever it is. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Tony, go ahead.
Oh, just quickly, gentlemen. And by the way, tuna too, being one of the larger fish consumed in Japan, maybe you could just tell everybody what fish that we know just quickly might have higher levels. Like that. Generally, I can tell you this: they swim pretty fast.
Yeah.
Yeah. The highest concentration is in herring. And then salmon. There's a fairly high concentration. I know Darren loves salmon, so he probably eats that 24/7. But yeah, that's another great fish.
Yeah, and it's weird, like there's bits in mackerel and of course red meat and all that. When you go down the line, you're like, why not poultry? And then dairy, you'd have to drink the whole cow to get an effective thing. And I argue, I said, that's why supplementation seemed to be so prevalent. When you ask people, they're like, well, the inflation and cost of food is through the roof in the world. Ethical use of animals, maybe you're a vegan, plant-based individual. All monohydrate, to my knowledge, is vegan or plant-based. So from a cost perspective, it might cost maybe 20 cents now for a teaspoon, whereas a steak might cost you, God, I have no idea, at a restaurant. And it's convenient. Now they put it in these little gummies or whatever it is. So it's one of those things that just seems to be a very easy thing. It's like omega-3 pills, right? People are allergic to seafood. I'll just take the pill and, get the benefits that way. So
this is a little bit of a sidebar. When my kids were young, they're in college now. Actually, one's in grad school at UCF with Jeff Stout. The other is finishing her undergrad in graphic design. But when they were young, I had them taking creatine. My wife and I, we ran a travel softball team, and we had our kids taking creatine. Now, also a lot of protein. But parents of the, girls on our team, the other parents thought it was odd. Like, and of course, they would say the same things that you've heard everyone say about, is it safe? Will it stunt their growth, et cetera, et cetera. That I'm not surprised of, but I still get pushback from physicians, athletic trainers, dietitians, despite the fact that there are literally hundreds of studies on creatine. So I'm not sure there's a question there, but there's something about the culture of these other professions that seems at odds with creatine, even though we all know there's hundreds of studies. So what's been your experience with that? I'll go to you first, Darren.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's probably one of the most common questions, but I always point to Andrew and Chad's reviews, and Andrew does a really elegant job summarizing the data, and he's very cautious to know the dose is going to be relatively same at whatever you want to do, but there's not been a lot of biomarkers on long-term safety. So anybody under the age of 18, we say a little bit of caution. But I argue I see no reason why, and I'll give you an example. They're producing in their kidneys and liver and brain the same creatine that typically you're either eating and or taking as a supplement. Is no different than protein. So the argument of not giving them creatine is the same as protein. And since the safety profile of creatine is probably the best in the world, it's probably the safest, most effective overall ergogenic aid we can probably take because it's in our body and the ILC can never take it away. And so I think we need to do a better job getting information out there, evidence-based research. I think the social influencers can be beneficial, but I do see a lot of misinformation. Like the other day, this guy who had over 100,000 followers was saying if you leave creatine monohydrate in your room for a little bit, it degrades the creatinine. And then I pulled up Rolf Yager's papers and I said, here's your clear evidence it doesn't. And it's funny though, people are going to follow these social influencers. So I think we need to do a little bit better job getting the evidence-based research out. And it is emerging. Before it was just for athletes, bigger, stronger, faster. It mimicked anabolic steroid use, and that was one of the biggest myths. People were getting bigger, and they're so parents, I can see why they were cautious. But I think we just got to get more information out there, more clinical trials, and that'll be a more effective way to do it. And GPs are very hesitant. They know what creatine is, but they're not really up to date on a lot of the data. So when you go to the doctor, and as Scott was talking about, oh, my serum creatinine is high, and I'm like, well, what about your urinary creatinine? They're like, why do you want to know that? I'm like, well, in our clinical trials, we do something called creatinine clearance, and you need to have the two going to understand you want high creatinine clearance. So there's a lot of, I guess, misinformation or myths that are still out there. And I think the only way to do it is more podcasts like this and trying to get information out there that we're not just making this stuff up. We spend a lot of money in clinical trials, and it's all done by good practice clinical guidelines, and we follow a lot of things, and we're not seeing any adverse effects.
Scott?
Yeah, it's crazy. I think there's just so many myths and misconceptions about creatine, but we know that creatine, at least in animal models, can be protective against traumatic brain injuries. And there's a few studies in children and adolescents that have shown enhanced recovery following a concussion. So it's kind of ironic, that you'll put your kid in a sport where they can get a concussion, or there's a high likelihood of getting a concussion, and they think that taking creatine is the unsafe thing to do, when it's actually, maybe playing football or hockey is actually way more unsafe than taking creatine is. But yeah, there's lots of evidence to show that creatine is not only effective in those populations, but also could be protective as well.
Yeah, fascinating to me that and I've run into the same thing, whey protein with creatine as an example, and parents being highly hesitant. And to your point, Scott, but right after football practice, they'll take them to 7-Eleven for Pop-Tarts and a Slurpee. And they're worried about creatine and whey protein. So it becomes fascinating. Two of the best substances you can put in the human body, and with the utmost benefit. And as Darren had said too, highly cost effective. Right?
So in terms of the two populations, I wanted to address, and you basically address the issue with kids that, they're already consuming protein, which has creatine, and creatine's already in your body. And then Scott alluded to some of the TBI data, traumatic brain injury data, in infants and young kids. And even there's a study in teenage fin swimmers showing that creatine supplementation helps performance. So the issue of under 18, I think there's not as much data there, but it makes sense to me that you can supplement with it, because to me, it's, as Darren alluded, it's sort of like if you look at the evolution of protein, this is sort of following that same track. So the question is, and that was sort of a long preamble. The question is, now let's look at sex differences if they exist. Sex differences and age differences. So let's first deal with sex. Is there a male-female difference? Take it away, gentlemen.
Yeah, so we've measured this repeatedly, and Mark Turner-Polsky was one of the first to look at this. So the thought was that there was a sex difference because there was some evidence to suggest, in general, if the female has smaller skeletal muscle compared to the anatomy of the male, they're going to have a higher concentration or higher resting initial creatine levels. And as Scott's already mentioned, that's probably the number one thing that dictates your responsiveness. That's why vegans seem to respond extremely well, where someone on a carnivore diet may not. But when you look at the totality of the evidence, males and females respond very well, if not the exact same, from a muscle growth or performance perspective. We see phenomenal benefits in females from a bone health perspective. And since it's emerging in the brain, the majority of those individual children that had concussion were female. So to me, I always say no, it makes no sense. Same response to protein. The only thing we've ever come across is from an anti-catabolic effect. So Johnny Parisi is at McMaster University, and when he measured leucine oxidation, or a direct indicator of whole body breakdown, it was only young males who had a reduction. And we've measured a few times this amino acid compound called 3-methylhistidine, is another crude indicator of whole body breakdown, and it was only reduced in males. So there was a few lines of evidence to suggest that males may have more anti-catabolic effects from creatine. And then I talked to Abby Smith-Ryan about this, and it might have to do with estrogen. Now, we don't know. We're speculating that was only the difference. But at the end of the day, I say there's a couple lines of evidence to suggest that males might have a more preservating environment for muscle recovery, but both males or females respond extremely well. So again, there's no reason I'm seeing that it's one sex or the other.
Scott, elaborate on that, as well as if there's age differences. If you're a young, strapping, college male versus old dudes like Tony.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to go back and highlight one study that was done by Abby Smith-Ryan as well. So I know Darren mentioned her. She's probably the best kind of creatine researcher in a female population. And she actually recently looked at the influence of creatine across the menstrual cycle. And interestingly, she showed actually no difference in body mass changes between creatine supplementation and placebo, either in the luteal phase or the follicular phase. But she did show it in the luteal phase that you tended to put on more water, which I thought was pretty interesting. So, and then I started thinking as well, I'm like, okay, if you're putting on water and not putting on mass, how does that actually work? But if you look at the data itself, it looks like they're trending in the same direction. So it does look like if you are a female taking creatine, you at least retain a little bit more water during the luteal phase compared to the follicular phase. So we need to watch more of Abby Smith-Ryan's research that's going to come out relatively soon. Again, looking at creatine supplementation in the female population. So there might be some differences, at least across the menstrual cycle. And then your question was looking at the effects of creatine in younger adults versus older adults. And that's an interesting question as well. And we know that it's actually effective in both those populations. So we've done a systematic review looking at over 35 individual studies were included. That included both younger populations and older populations. And we showed from a lean tissue mass perspective that they were similar. So that's, some positive evidence that creatine could be a benefit for not only younger individuals trying to put on muscle, but also older adults as well.
That's good news for us, Tony.
Yeah, just quick question. Yeah, exactly. And quick question, Darren, Scott, do we know, it would probably make sense because particularly if the individual as they age is undergoing sarcopenia, but do we know if endogenous production, there's a significant decline as one ages, assuming even with, dietary factors being equal? Do we know anything much about that or?
Yeah, so there's,
go ahead.
There's a nice review that Darren was a part of, Chillibeck 2017, that looked at how much creatine was in different muscles in the body.
Okay.
And they actually showed no difference between young and old when they included all the muscles. But when they just looked at the vastus lateralis, there was actually less creatine in an older individual compared to a younger individual.
Okay.
So it might be muscle specific,
Got it.
at least again with the responsiveness to creatine supplementation.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Very
Yeah, the phospho-creatine kinetics in aging is very, there's tons of variability. You'll see a lot of, Paul Greenhalgh would argue there's no differences. And then even in the lower limb, we saw no difference in the gastroc and tibialis anterior, but the muscles that are mainly used for high explosive movements, squat, leg press, sprinting, the vastus lateralis was different. So that's why we think when you look at the overall results, the lower body seems to really improve statistically with creatine supplementation, and that may be because they're impaired. So when you look at all that, and so I argue it's like, when people are designing resistance training programs for an older adult, make sure you do way more volume for the lower limbs than the upper limbs because they're compromised. We published a study in 2005 clearly showing that aging negatively affects all muscle groups in the body, but the lower regions were more negatively affected. So therefore, when you're doing 3 sets for your upper body, you're probably wanting to do 5 or 6 sets for the lower body just to offset the negative effects of aging.
Wow, really interesting. And I guess in part that could be specificity regarding activity too,
Yes.
right? People tend to explode less as they age and maybe the demand isn't there for production.
Yeah.
But that's great. Good to know. Really interesting.
And it makes sense as we get older, escalators are used more often, elevators, you don't see a lot of
Perfect,
people
yeah.
sprinting and all that. And we kind of lie to people as they get older, say, oh, you're too old to do that, take your time. In theory, that's why power training has become so popular and resistance training should be looked at. And I'm very happy to see a lot of older people in the gyms nowadays, way more than it used to be. And the lower limbs are so important for functionality and withstanding falls and fractures and all that. And it just clearly shows if you're having more reduction in one part of the body, and that could be because they're more active in the upper body, you might have to do more volume to offset the negative effects. But what do most people do, especially males? We skip legs. It's
Exactly.
very stereotypical, but a lot of times they'll skip legs, right? So especially with our older populations, leg press and squat, if it can be done, leg extension, those things are super important, right? So
Fantastic information, right?
Yeah.
Hey, Scott, you had mentioned earlier the, correct me if I'm wrong, during Abby's data, during the luteal phase, there tends to be more of a gain in total body water. Was that correct?
Correct, yeah. So they looked at total body water, but also intracellular and extracellular, and they showed an increase in water retention in all those compartments during the luteal phase with creatine.
A common question I get from women, particularly, and this is why it's hard to recruit them, at least down here in South Florida, for creatine studies is, hey, my friends say you'll get bloated. I don't want to feel bloated. Frankly, I've never heard a guy tell that to me. A guy's never said, I don't care about, I care about bloating. It's always females. So bloating technique, I mean, it's not a scientific term. So what do you say in terms of that? Because there is data showing you do gain some water, but it's only during one phase. How would you address that question?
Yeah, so usually I ask them if they want to put on some muscle mass and perhaps also lose a little bit of fat mass. So we've actually shown in an older population that if you take creatine and you perform resistance training, that your percent body fat is reduced and you lose about 0.5 kilogram more fat mass compared to just resistance training and placebo. So I think that's how I would frame it is basically, do you want to improve your body composition? Here's a supplement that can actually improve your body composition. And then, then you'll hear all the negative side effects of, well, it's just going to cause bloating and all these different things. But I think that's why some of Abby Smith-Ryan's research is really, really important to show kind of what the actual effects are. And interestingly, she actually showed no change in body mass with creatine supplementation in any phase of the menstrual cycle. So it didn't have a big change in body mass, at least in her sample size.
Yeah, that's the general consensus with Christy Sale, and the menstrual cycle is irrelevant when it comes to adaptations with exercise. It doesn't matter in the follicular phase or when the egg is being sloughed in luteal or during menses. You're going to have fluctuations with hydration, temperature, environment. And with creatine, if it's intracellular or extracellular, as Scott said, to me, it's a moot point. It doesn't really influence the individual's performance. And you got to be careful with the way they measure things. Of course, fat mass and lean mass is different than muscle and things like that. But to do a clinical trial and get every female to stay in the exact same phase of their menstrual cycle over time is literally impossible. It is, and there's no way to do it. And that's why you try to control as much. And then oral contraception is another thing that can influence or block it. So that's why when we move to the postmenopausal population, it gets a little bit more strict, because 12 months post last menses can be controlled for a little bit more. And so at the end of it, is estrogen influencing the adaptations? If it is, at this point, it's got to be really, really minimal. And I probably wouldn't even chalk it up to anything meaningful.
Yeah, I think it's important you bring up the pragmatic question, because, you know, I've worked with a lot of endurance athletes and a lot of distance runners, and I'd say a lot of them are amenorrheic and like it that way. They're like, hey, I haven't had a period in 2 years and I really don't want one. So for them, you know, the issue of whichever phase they're in is a moot point, because there's no phase, they're amenorrheic. So, but I think that's important, that in the grand scheme of things, it may not matter, since you're training all year. It's not like you're well, during this phase, I'll train this way. And I don't think you could get down to that kind of detail.
Yeah. And I think one of the studies that needs to be done is looking at people on a hypocaloric diet. Can creatine rescue some of the offsetting effects? UFC, trying to make weight, or boxing, or track and field, can creatine, just like protein, you know, when you're on a hypocaloric diet, you increase protein, you retain lean mass. Well, can creatine help rescue some of those catabolic effects of low energy, being lethargic or whatever? And of course, me and Scott and Tony did that paper on mixed martial arts. And again, I agree. Like, most people say, can a bodybuilder going on stage take creatine? And I'm like, of course they can. Like, if you understand the principles of intracellular water and things like that, it's hyperhydrating, not dehydrating. So again, we just got to do better to get all this information out there from an evidence-based perspective. Yeah.
And Darren, earlier you had said you take creatine during training. That's how you get 10 grams. Talk a little bit about the data in terms of using it intra-training, within the training period.
Yeah, there's only been one study, and the branched chain amino acid drinking during the thing was so popular. I was like, well, geez, you know, branched chains have some pros and cons, and why can't creatine be looked at? So we're kind of wrestling with this timing thing. We've sort of done a series of studies, but we didn't ever look at the effects of sipping a small amount of creatine in water after every set. So my master's student, who's a current PhD student, and he's still looking at creatine timing, he simply did 18 sets and had a small mouthful of creatine. It was a small amount. It was less than 0.3 grams per sip. And lo and behold, it was very convenient. They just put the creatine in the water bottle they were drinking during a weight training session. They trained multiple days a week, and it significantly increased measures of muscle strength over placebo. So it's a first line evidence to suggest it's just another viable strategy. You can take creatine in the morning, pre-workout, during, after, before you go to bed. At the end of the day, it still has to accumulate. It's not like caffeine. But the theory with creatine transport kinetics, it used to be thought of as blood flow, and we don't think that's really there. I think when the doorways are more sensitive to muscle contraction, it may allow creatine to get in a little bit quicker, which could accumulate over time. So I think if creatine is in close proximity to exercise, that's great. But a study came out this year, you can take it in the morning or in the evening. As long as you combine it with weight training, that seems to be effective. And the totality of evidence will be 98% is creatine's effective with exercise. A few studies show creatine from a muscle perspective, it doesn't. But nice thing is, from the neck up, you don't necessarily need to perform exercise. Now, they might have been performing activities of daily living, but creatine, for the most part, from a performance perspective, has to be combined with some type of exercise, either aerobic or resistance training. It's not magic. It doesn't increase the rates of protein synthesis like protein does. It sort of needs to be stimulated to cause those effects.
And that brings us to, and we have limited time, so I want Scott to address this. Creatine obviously has its roots primarily from the sporting perspective in terms of bodybuilding and the strength power sports. However, endurance athletes, I call it the run, bike, swim sports, or the podium sports, obviously running is different than swimming or cycling, because running, you're carrying your body weight, cycling, your body weight supported, swimming, your body weight supported, hey, paddling, my body weight supported. How would you address the use of creatine for those kinds of athletes?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and it requires a little bit of context because if we just look at steady state, moderate intensity, continuous exercise, and we understand metabolism, the creatine energy system is not really involved in that particular type of event. But any event where there's a change in pace, or there's like hills that you have to sprint up, or even finishing kicks, in particular races, that's really, really important. I think that creatine energy system can be important for that. And then we also know that creatine combined with carbohydrates can bring in more glycogen into your muscle as well. And that could be a benefit for endurance individuals as well. So there's some context that's required to say that creatine can be a benefit for endurance athletes. And as you mentioned, perhaps the water retention and gain in body mass could be a detriment for runners, for example, that have to carry their body weight. But for cyclists, rowers, kayakers, stand-up paddleboard, whatever, swimmers, that increase in body weight is really not a negative thing. And having a better kind of high intensity energy system to perform those bursts of activity could really be a benefit for those endurance athletes.
Yeah, Tony, you work with athletes that do strength power training, they do endurance training. I mean, the fight sports are among the most, if not the most complicated sports to train for. What's your philosophy in terms of when they should take creatine? And if there are some athletes who should not, let's say they gain weight too easily, they want to be in a lower weight class, things like that.
Yeah, honestly, I have not found too many people that have debilitating weight gain from it that can't be easily manipulated. So I'm an advocate, just like the gentlemen who were joining us, Darren and Scott, that fighters should be on it all the time for a host of reasons. So the neuroprotective benefits, right? Potential recovery aspects, immunoprotection. I mean, all of these systems are being taxed significantly, particularly during caloric restriction when you start getting 6, 7, 8 weeks out. So I've never had any limitations on it other than, as we discussed, even in our paper too, what I might do if first of all, with a fighter, it's hard to get them to do anything all the time. Yeah. So, I get worried when they cross the street by themselves. Yeah. Never mind, them adhering to everything. But that said, what we will do often is upfront the creatine early so we can see if there's, and the calorie intake is relatively consistent early in camp. Did they put any weight on? How much over the period of 2 weeks, maybe 14 to 12 weeks out? And then we have to account for that. It's just something that potentially maybe we have to address as we get 2 weeks out. And both Scott and Darren have told me that, after 10 to 12 weeks of consistent ingestion, if we titrate a little bit come week 2 and week 1, we're going to still retain the benefit anyway. So we might pull it back a little bit. And you're talking about cutting it in half potentially, right? So anyway, from that perspective, I think it's not good for the fighter. I think it's outstanding for them. And it may be the one supplement above and beyond all that they demand most. And if there's any manipulation necessary, you can work it easily, right? And gentlemen, am I correct in saying if somebody was on 10 grams for 10 to 12 weeks and titrated just a little bit over a couple of weeks, much of that benefit would sustain? Am I correct? Or
yeah, absolutely. There's evidence to show it takes 4 to 6 weeks for creatine from saturation levels, if that's even a thing, to go back down to baseline levels. So it takes a long time. So yeah, if you go off creatine for a week, it's not going to have a big impact on your muscle creatine levels.
Yeah. Eric Holtman was the first study to do it in 96. He actually showed you don't need 10 to 12 weeks. In 7 days, you could do it, or 30 grams or 3 grams for 30 days. And it took about 30 days to come back. But Vandenberg was the other one that put it in real life terms in young females. That took 28 days. They're young people. We've done a study where we measured them 12 weeks post, and they still maintain some strength. So from a decreasing intracellular creatine might take 30 days, but the muscle has that so-called memory. You're still going to get the benefits after. So if they say, I want to cycle and go whatever, and again, the study's never been done, which is shocking, but You could go on it for 4 weeks. That's plenty. And if they want to take 4 weeks off, sure, you're still going to get the benefits.
Got it.
Do you need to
by-
cycle it? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's outstanding to know. Really good. And by the way, they are tearing through it. Okay,
Yes.
so
Yeah.
they are, it's not as if they're taking it and it's sitting around just waiting for them to do something. So they're consuming large amounts of it. So
Hey, a couple of fun questions. We got to respect your time. First, we'll go to you, Scott. Supplements you take, or at least recommend people take, that is not creatine. Obviously, we all recommend creatine, but what are some other supplements? Let's say, your top 3 or 4.
Yeah, so after I perform resistance training, I take protein and creatine combined. It's actually better than just either creatine or protein alone. So those are kind of my main supplements I take, but I also take zinc as well. And I take some probiotics and prebiotics as well. So I don't know, there's a lot of exploding research looking at gut health and all those great things that's linked to brain health and all these other kind of important aspects. So I'm like, okay, I got to get on that train and try some of these prebiotic and probiotics out.
Darren?
Yeah, so whey protein for sure. I take about 3 grams of omega-3s. I'll take 2,000 international units of vitamin D a day, even though I'm not deficient, but it actually has more antioxidant properties than vitamin C and zinc. So that was a huge thing, especially in Canadian winters. And then I take a Lyme probiotic at night. And the other big one is Advil. I'll take an Advil when I'm inflamed. There's massive benefits to potentially an anti-inflammatory effect. That's a drug effect, not promoting it, but when you're in heightened inflammation, it can recover the body. Those are the big ones for sure, independent, obviously, of creatine. Yeah.
Do you know what your 25 hydroxy-D levels are? I'm just curious, since you guys are up north.
No, I haven't had that measured in a long time. And it's that one's a tough one because the older the studies that come out, if they're taking massive mega doses, and if you're not deficient, it causes fracture and that. But in Saskatchewan, especially, really good research at the University of Saskatchewan, we're recommending 2,000 international units in the severe winter because you can't go outside. It's so cold. The sun is very less time. But I was more interested in looking at the antioxidant effects and anti-inflammatory effects. And it's one that I just take as almost like a multivitamin. It's not going to hurt you. It's probably not going to help you.
Yeah, I haven't looked at my levels, but based on how pale I am, I've booked a plane ticket down to Florida in June.
Yeah.
So I'm really looking
attaboy,
forward to that.
we'll load you up on that, Scotty. We'll load you up.
Exactly.
And then one final question, because, when people view us who work in sports science, they must think all we do is read science, although we read a lot of science, but there must be other things you read. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I'm a big fan. I read actually a lot of fiction. I'm a big fan of Lee Child's Jack Reacher series. I've read all his books. So Scott, what do you read that's not, this geek science stuff that, that we embed ourselves with?
I actually don't read besides just the geek science stuff. So sorry about kind of making that stereotype even stronger. But yeah, the last book I read was the Science of Hypertrophy by Brad Schoenfeld. So I don't know if that's fiction or nonfiction, but yeah, that was an interesting read.
Oh, Darren, that's funny, Scott.
I love the Dave Balducci lines. Very similar to Jack Reacher. I got the Kindle going. And then I also love the autobiographies. I loved every one's from Lance Armstrong's all the way up to Theo Fleury's to some of the ones lately that have a more personal connection. So that seems to create my interest. I can almost visualize. And the Dan Brown series with Da Vinci Code, I could almost visualize Tom Hanks act. So my brain is very pea brain, but if I can visualize something, it seems to work. But that Balducci guy seems to catch me. He's got some pretty cool creativity there.
Do you read any of the Vince Flynn novels?
I have not. No, I'll check it out though for sure.
Yeah, those are good. The author died. Vince Flynn and Mitch Rapp is the character, but but yeah, his initial series are super interesting. So Scott, he stays to the geek stuff. Darren and I, we try to expand our horizons with some of this fiction work. Tony, he just reads.
I got 2 young kids at home, so it's it's pretty busy. So I do read some books. I guess I read Diary of a Wimpy Kid with my daughter, it's hilarious actually. I love it. But Yeah, it's not the type of reads that you're probably looking for.
Yeah.
Tony, any final comments?
Yeah, well, thank you, gentlemen, because this is fantastic. And I hope this gets out. We will certainly do our best to get it out to a lot of people in the health, fitness community, because really great information. And I've walked away a lot more knowledgeable from both of you. I appreciate it, truly. This was excellent.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks
Yeah,
for having us on. And yeah, it's
Yep.
fantastic.
Yeah, this was great, gentlemen. One last thing before we sign off, I want to mention the ISSN conference, June 15 to 17. You can register at issn.net. That's issn.net. I know, Dr. Candow, you won't be there. Maybe next year we'll still be
Next
in
year.
Florida. So,
Next year for sure.
There. And Scott, we'll see you at ISSN. Tony, thank you very much. Gentlemen, you have
Thanks,
a
gentlemen.
great evening.
All
We'll
right.
see you
Thanks, guys.
soon.
See you guys. Take care.
Take